Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Omohundro Institute Digital Projects Coffee House. I'm excited to have you back for the fall term. My name is Jim Ambuski, and I am delighted, as always, to be joined by Martha Howard, who is my co-convener of this series. Deepthi will give us a presentation of about 15 minutes or so about her project, which we'll introduce shortly, after which we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. Dr. Deepthi Murali is an assistant professor of history and art history at George Mason University, and she is one of the key architects of Connecting Threads about the textile trade from South Asia to the Caribbean. Deepthi, the floor is yours.
Thank you for coming today. And I will be talking sort of briefly about what the Connecting Threads project is. This is a collaborative project, and I'll talk about the collaborative process of it in a little bit. This is a Born Digital public first project, which essentially is how I term original scholarship that we have done a lot of research around, but are presenting first to the people that are our publics rather than presenting it within the academy. So that's sort of how we have always envisioned the project. Connecting Threads is really about looking at a lot of checked cotton textiles, such as the ones you see the women wearing in this painting, which is there are two women here, and you can see them both dressed in their finery, actually, because you can see that both of them are wearing shoes, they are wearing a really fancy jewelry, and they are washing a deer in this picture. This is one of the paintings by an Italian painter named Agostino Brunius, who in the sort of mid to late 18th century worked around the Caribbean region, painting portraits and genre paintings of people, especially free and enslaved communities of color. And he was really working for the plantation owners. So he's a slightly controversial artist to be looking at as the first image. But I like bringing his paintings up because what Brunius does is take really, while we can't see him as a documentary evidence-based painter, he does give us a lot of details. And it is from these details that we know how women in this part of the world actually dressed, or what their sense of fashion was, or how they thought about their identity through dress. And so here we have been able to look at these two women figures in the painting, and we were able to trace their handkerchiefs back, the handkerchiefs that they're tying up as head wraps, back to two pieces or examples of two pieces at the Victoria and Albert Museum. This is where our project really started, where we were looking at different kinds of checked cotton textiles from India that were produced in India that were actually brought over to the Caribbean by mostly European East India companies in the 18th and 19th centuries, and were used widely by free and enslaved women of color and broadly communities of color. And our question really was like, why these textiles? So we saw them in all sorts of paintings. This is another example of a Brunius painting showing these handkerchiefs and how they were used. It's actually called the handkerchief dance. So here you see a scene of a bride and a groom dancing at the wedding. The bride is coyly dancing with one hand with a handkerchief that's like a white with blue borders, lightly checked. We can't really quite see that from this image. And the groom is wearing a red and white checked cotton textile. And you can see that the checked white, red and white is also worn by this woman here and this little girl here. You can also see different classes of communities of color in this painting, all using these handkerchiefs in different ways. So here you can see that this might be an enslaved person here. They are also using the handkerchiefs, as well as this woman might be a Creole woman with more means, and that, by her wearing a hat on top of the headscarves. So you see that a wide swath of Caribbean communities in the 18th and the 19th centuries were making use of these handkerchiefs. Now, when we think of handkerchiefs, we're thinking about like the pocket kerchiefs. That's how we use the term. But in the 18th and the 19th century, the handkerchiefs we are talking about are quite a bit larger. They are 90 centimeters by 90 centimeters, so like a yard square. And they were largely used as headscarves and neck cloths in the Caribbean and in the southeastern United States. So, which is why we call it the Greater Caribbean region, where there's a lot of African Caribbean descendant influence in the dress and identities of people in the region that we study. But all of them were interested in using these kind of checked cotton textiles. And in the 18th and into the early 19th century, most of these or all of these came from India. Now, we have called them Madras handkerchief, and I can talk a little bit more about why they're called Madras handkerchief, even though they have many different terminologies. They're known by different names. So they're known by their subtypes. They're can be called Madras, but they can also be called Pulicat and Ventapulam based on where they were made. They are called by the way they are used in the Greater Caribbean region. So in New Orleans, they were called Tignon. In Jamaica, they were often called bandana. So there are different ways in which they are termed. We are calling it Madras handkerchief because a large part of the Caribbean, they use the term Madras to address these handkerchiefs. And this continue to be called Madras in the region today because they continue to use these checked textiles in their dress and fashion. But we call them Madras also because Madras becomes the major port in southern India from where these textiles get exported in the 18th and the 19th century once the British East India Company kind of displaces the Dutch East India Company and the French East India Company and other competitors to actually take over most of this trade. So our project really started from asking these questions of why these checked cotton textiles, where did they come from, how did they get to the Caribbean, who made them, where were they being made. Even though we knew they were called Madras, we knew it was not being all made in Madras because we see conflicting sort of information about that. And then overall, the questions were what do their production, circulation, and use in the 18th and the 19th century tell us about global networks of trade, colonial encounters, fashion, and dress. So that's sort of where we kind of started this project with. My co-PI, Dr. Meha Priyadarshini, is at University of Edinburgh. She's a material cultural historian. And my other co-PI is Avalon Fotheringham, who's the curator of South Asia textiles at Victoria and Albert Museum. So Meha and I met during the pandemic in my first or second year at Mason when I was a postdoc. And then I had put up this webinar because it was pandemic and everybody were doing webinars. And we met through the webinar series. And I was beginning to work on chintz textiles, and not these textiles, but more elaborate textiles, and thinking about them as a project to do as a DH project, as a digital history project. And so Meha came in and said hey, how about we look at the checked cotton textiles, because she works with the interconnections between material culture from Southeast Asia and East Asia in Latin America. And she's I keep saying the word Pulicat handkerchiefs in the archives, and I know Pulicat is in India, so I don't understand why it is there. And so I was great, let's kind of see what we can come up with in doing research and putting together a grant for this project. So we've been funded since 2022 by different grant organizations, including the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Arts and Humanities Research Council in UK. And the project has more members than this. We have a larger core team, as well as a lot of collaborators at various archives and museum institutions across the US, UK, India, and the Caribbean. Just as these textiles were really in fashion and were really sought after in the Caribbean, they were also being used in India. So this is the Madras handkerchief, or the checked cotton textile, is one of the first global commodities. Indian textiles are the first global commodities, and within them, these checked cotton textiles were often the ones that are sort of the unsung heroes, mainly because most of the attention goes to the silks from India or the chintzes from India. And the checked cotton textiles are not as expensive as these other clothing fabrics that got exported out of India, mostly also because the checked cotton textiles were being used by the working classes. So in India too, these textiles were being used by the 18th century by the laboring classes, or they were attached to different occupational caste groups. So for example, you see a man wearing a longer checked cotton textile, so a bit longer than the Madras handkerchief, He is from the Muslim Labbai community who really started using them as these lungis or waistcloths. And it is widely credited to this community for carrying the lungi across the Indian Ocean world and making it part of the dress and dress culture of many communities across the Indian Ocean world. You see the woman here wearing like a yellow check cotton textile, and only this particular caste group that this woman belonged to would wear this particular sari in checked cotton. And then you see a man here using it the same way as these women are wearing it as a headcloth. One of our primary pet peeves, and Jim is not going to like me saying this, is that the Scottish tartan takes over everything else that is checked. So if a lot of people ask me, why is this not plaid or why is this not tartan? There's a lot of people in the past who have said that it is from tartan that these checked textiles were, invented or the Indians got inspired by the tartans. I'd like to point out that this is not true because you see in 15th and 16th century temple murals in southern India, people of means that are painted in these frescoes wearing checked cotton, and this predates the arrival of tartan via the British East India Company officials in India. So there is a clear distinction between the use of checked cotton in India versus the use of checked fabric in Scotland. And so there is that distinction that's ever been present, but we call ourselves sometimes the anti-tartan squad because, we are always going and talking to people about how this is not tartan. But the point being, these check textiles have a longer history of use in India before they get to the Caribbean. And they're also at this period being used in different ways in Southeast Asia as well as in West Africa. So that's for later part of the project. But essentially, even though they were used by sort of elite classes, like you saw in these frescoes, by the time it's 18th century, they are being used by the working classes in India. So there's a big caste, lower caste attached association to these checked cotton textiles in India. And so they're still being used by working classes across India as they are in the Caribbean. I have a QR code here. You can actually use a QR code to go see look at the check textile more closely. In India, you'll see that the colorways are a little different from the ones that we kind of see mostly being used in the Caribbean. So here you can see there's a predominance of red and white, whereas in India, you see more blue and white being used. But even in the Caribbean, in different parts of the Caribbean, different colorways become more prominent. And that's also part of our research. So we are really interested in looking at, yes, we know that it came from India to the Caribbean, but there are these different complexities to the way these textiles were produced, but also consumed, as well as circulated across through transoceanic means. I talked a little bit about the textile terminologies and how they're called different things in different parts of the world, and even within the same parts of the world. But there are also a wide variety of these textiles being used. And one of the things that we've been most interested in tracing is how, while Madras handkerchief is produced in this region, they are not only called different things, but you find that their use is attached to some of their technical qualities. So, for example, this particular specific type of textile, it is called Ventapulam handkerchief because in that particular region, the yarn that was used to make these textiles, it was rubbed with conch shell. So the calcium from the conch shell would create this glazing of the yarn. So it already looked shiny and polished even before it was woven into fabric. And so that was a technique that was being used only in this village of Ventapulam in the southeastern coast of India. And so each of those textiles could have specializations by means of dyes used, by means of techniques used. And those were not guarded secrets, but it was really tied to the environment. You use raw materials that you could source locally. So There are instances of some of these textiles having really steadfast colors because they were being washed in the local river, where that river had a lot of calcium mineralic deposits that allowed for certain dye chemical compositions to react with the water and become more fast with the clothes. So there are a lot of different ways in which the local environment affected the production of these textiles. And they will look kind of simple when we look at it this way. But for creating each of these checks, it's a really complex process, both of weaving, but also of dyeing. And one of the reasons why these textiles and other textiles from India were so sought after across the world was because of the colors just staying true and never washing off, which was something unheard of outside of India in this time period. And that too, they were using natural dye. So there's a lot of complexities to the production of these textiles. And those complexities came from both the way they were produced, but also in the manners in which they're used. So here, very quickly, I wanted to bring in how these textiles are produced within India and how they were being used in the Caribbean as an example of like both complexities of production and consumption. So on the left, there's an sort of like an ethnographic watercolor painting of a group of weavers or a weaving community at work. Often in India, the weavers always worked in family units. There are occupational caste groups that worked as weavers, and within each local villages or a community, they would make only specific kinds of textiles. Not all textiles were made by one set of weavers or one family of weavers. But what you can see also from this painting is that a lot of the work that included like making the bobbins for the weft, cleaning the cotton and carding it, or spinning it and creating the cotton in spools that you can use. Those were all activities taken care of by women in the family, and often it would be a male weaver who's weaving it. So these were family units. The dyeing, weaving, carding, spinning, those were all being done locally. And then within that, you would have also intermediaries who are like Indian merchants and traders of a different caste group who actually work with these weavers to create the design or get the created material back to the East India companies. And the one thing that we really wanted to focus on in this project was to look at these global South-to-South connections. So one of the things that we have found out in the course of our research is these women, for example, in New Orleans and in the Caribbean countries, in the Caribbean cultures, they were having very specific requests or requirements for what kind of textiles they wanted to use. So within the Madras handkerchief, there are lots of archival records where the consumers in the Caribbean are saying, okay, we want this particular kind of quality, we want this kind of colorway, we want this kind of pattern or design. And some of these also being enslaved people, but also people of color more broadly who are using these textiles, they are actually telling as consumers that they want certain kinds of textiles. So for example, in this record, they're saying this request for richer patterns of green and purple to be exceptionally fine, and only if they're of exceptional quality will they sell in the Caribbean. So the idea really being that when we think of free and enslaved people in the Caribbean who have often restricted through sumptuary laws and other means to not have full body autonomy, we're still seeing that sort of viewpoint being complicated by the way they're sharing their taste preferences via the East India companies back to India, where the weavers then are quite agile at changing and responding to these kinds of requests. So considering that this actually took like a year at least of the communication to happen between the Indian weaver and the Caribbean consumer, they are actually taking the information and then reproducing things to the liking of the consumer. So this is sort of like a complexity that we are very keen on pursuing and seeing more of it. And we have some archival records that actually talk about this in our database right now. By the late 18th century and into the 19th century, there is trouble in paradise, so to speak, where imitations are being introduced by the British. Though the Industrial Revolution, one can claim, started because the British wanted cheaper cotton or cheaper ways of producing cotton. So once the cotton machine, the loom, was invented, you see that the British and other Europeans are producing imitations of these checked cotton textiles from India and sending those to the Caribbean. Now, so there are a bunch of different ways in which happens in the 18th century. You see local cotton being used from India, natural dyes produced in India being used to produce the material. Weavers in India would produce them. The Indian merchants would then help the East India companies get them to the Caribbean and US. And then you see in the late 18th centuries, the cotton production from America, again, produced through labor of enslaved people, they actually start getting to the European mills. And then from there, they're being produced sent to the Caribbean and the US. And by the 19th century, what happens is the Europeans kind of take away all the cotton production from India, from the Indian weavers, and they almost all make it in the mills in Europe. And then they send it back, not just to Caribbean, but also to the Indian markets. So you see this thing where not only the weavers in India lose their livelihoods through the late 18th and 19th century, but even by producing cheap cottons in Europe, they actually exported back to India and kind of completely tank the Indian textile industry, and the Indian textile industry never recovers. Which leads to the last part of this sort of cycle, where from places like New Orleans, where Creole women, well, today we think of Creole as descendants of hybrid cultures, but in the 18th century, Creole women in New Orleans were white women who were born in New Orleans, European women born in New Orleans. And when they actually adopt some of these sort of like fashion or dress culture from the local free and enslaved women, they take it back with them to Europe. And in Europe, these things start getting fashionable and they get exoticized. So there is an appropriation that happens of the culture of the Caribbean women, African Caribbean women, but then it also starts getting exoticized. So in this image, you can see that this woman who was a socialized likes dressing up in the Caribbean style. But then once a satirical print is made of her, like that Caribbean-ness is exoticized and made a caricature of. So you see the sort of, while the production of these textiles are being taken up over by European mills and then imitations being produced, they're also imitating the Caribbean consumers who are using these textiles and exporting that fashion to Europe at the same time. There's also another kind of appropriation that sort of happens with the working classes. And this is sort of like the working classes across Europe start using these checked cotton textiles also as headscarves and part of their work attire. By this time, there are mill-made cottons, for example, in France, that are producing these checked textiles for export to the Caribbean. But the local people only know them as checked cotton textiles produced in France. So they start also using these cheap imitation cotton as part of their work attire. It's, for example, like the grisettes, who are a class of young working women in Bordeaux, they are using this widely, both as neck cloths and as headscarves, as you can see in this picture. Checked textiles are still very much a part of the culture of the Caribbean. It's got like a controversial history to it. It continues to be used. It's part of the national costumes of many Caribbean countries, but also its connection to India has been completely cut off since in the post-colonial era, because these colonizing agents were the ones who were the middlemen. Once the colonizing agents went away, that Caribbean to India connection was cut off. So they are still called Madras in many parts of the Caribbean, but they don't know that they came from India. Like most people don't have that knowledge. And now the checked textiles used now are not coming from India. They come from various places, including China and Vietnam, but they're not coming in from India anymore into the Caribbean. It was also seen in many places as a controversial colonizers object because it is associated with the colonial period. And so in places like Jamaica, there's a lot of people who want to not make it part of their national costume, and there's a lot of controversy surrounding that. So it continues to be an object of contention and a dialogue across the Caribbean today. Also still in use in India, the caste association with lungi, as they're called, as they are used as the waistcloth, because they were associated with caste and with the working class, the lungi was not something that people wanted to wear, but it has had a makeover in the last decade or so with a lot of attention by especially Gen Z, urban youth who are using lungi in fashionable ways across India. So you see a lot of attention now being paid to the lungi once again. I wanted to take a minute to show you the website. So we have a full exhibition here that talks about Madras in South India, Madras in the Greater Caribbean, Madras in Europe, and the continuing legacies of Madras. So you can enter any one of these sections if you're interested in taking a look at it. We also have a full database. So any information that we have gathered, you can find the original primary source citations here. We also created some lesson plans that you can use in your classes. So you can make use of the database and the exhibition in your classes through using our lesson plans. We also have a full bibliography on Zotero, which is very, very, very extensive. So if you're anything related to textiles and you want to look at information, I would highly recommend you go to our bibliography on Zotero from our link. And then we also have a few essays on basic concepts that you might want to know of in the project. Now, this is a work in progress. We were supposed to do more work in terms of data visualization and things this year. Unfortunately, our NEH grant that we had for the project was canceled by DOGE. So we've been trying to kind of go back to the drawing board a little bit to figure out a new schedule for ourselves. But I welcome all of you to take a look at the website. There's a QR code here that you can use to get to the website if you're interested, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Deepthi, that was great. Thank you very much. Actually, I've been talking with you about this project for years, but I find that every time I hear you present, I learn something entirely new, and I have so many more questions that I think we have time for. But I thought actually we might start with something that you said that really intrigued me at the beginning, which was when you were on webinars and figuring out what to do during the days of the pandemic, and you were conceiving this project, and you had mentioned that this is a scholarly project that is public first, and then for our peers in the academy. Can you talk us through some of the thinking behind that choice and how you see it fitting in with scholarship, but more importantly, digital public history?
So all of us on the project, we work on global histories to some extent. And most of the time, when we are all in the Western Academy, trained in the Western Academy, working in the Western Academy. And one of the things that we really were conscious is that we wanted to make sure that we were making this accessible to the communities that we are studying. So the histories of the communities that we are studying. So we wanted to make it easier for people in the Caribbean, people in India to also access the information that we are collecting. And that we were sure did not happen in an academic press publication, because those don't even get outside of the Western academic sphere. So what we wanted was an open, accessible website that everybody could access, but also make sure that we're not only producing showing interpretive work, which is what we did with the exhibition, the digital exhibition, but we wanted to make sure that the primary sources were also being made available. And so that we approached this as a multi-pronged element that communicated both primary, secondary source research that we did, as well as our interpretations, all in one website to these communities.
Thank you. Ann Smart Martin.
What a wonderful project, Deepthi. And it's so admirable in so many ways. The way you were able to not only place the objects front and center, but then also layer them into the place and time and the trade routes, which is fabulous. And Jim picked up on my first question too, which is the idea of born digital, which I think does sidestep some of the questions that digital projects face today, which is how do we incorporate them within an academic model, which does privilege ideas about who is commenting, um, who, what is the, what is the ways in which it is accepted in academic writing, and how do we sort of we can wave our way around it when it's, I like your phrase, digital first versus having to do something first and then do the digital as a secondary to a book or something like that. And two other quick questions. One is that I have another project you know about in the 1750s in Virginia. And again, it's a merchant and his own trade routes. And yes, it's Scotland, but I'm not blaming Scotland for anything. Trust me, it's not Madras. But they also use the word Saskakundi as a descriptor. And this is a man who uses very few descriptors. And I think I've assumed that it's something to do with location. And I just want you to comment on that if you can. If there's other places that are mentioned that, other places like that are mentioned in your work. And again, it's earlier than some of what you've been doing.
Yes, thank you, and I love your project so much. It is so fun. And yeah, Shastakundi is a word that you come across in the British East India Company archive records a lot. Their textiles are being exported in the 18th century for sure, because I've seen multiple mentions of them. They're usually in ledgers, like along with these other things, Madras. And but yeah, the place-based names are actually confusing because sometimes it is associated with certain textiles, but because Shastakundi, I think, is associated with a particular textile, like Selampur is. Selampur literally means the textile from Salem, which is a place in southern India, but it's not produced in Salem. Selampur just is a striped textile by the time it's the 18th century, because it's been produced all across India. It's called Selampur now. So it's so hard to trace those terminologies because you don't know when it stops being place-based and becomes like a type-based name. And so it's very confusing unless you can actually dig through and figure out where they were first mentioned. And all these textiles also are more complicated because then the production keeps changing from one place to another. And so with their production change, you don't know whether their names change because the production of the place changed, or if something new was introduced into the technology or the people who are producing them. So the terminologies are always very confusing, and you get a lot of them.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm hearing from you is that it's a terminology. And one of the things I'm very interested in, I know you are too, is the terminology itself, the language, and what is being used to comment upon and separate out the different categories. So that this is he gives very few definitions, but this one pops out. So I can refer to it as not just a place name, but also possibly a evolving idea of something called out.
Yes, definitely.
All right, my last one, which was something about, you also answered because my question was why yard by yard, and why that size becomes definite. And you said in the by 1790s, it has to be that. Is there something about production or something? Why that size? And then I'll let it go.
They're really because how they're used. So I didn't bring a picture with me in this presentation, but they're basically being tied and then they're like knotted.
Sure.
And like, in different ways. And I think that square, the square is necessary to create those headdresses and wrap them in certain ways. So often what they're doing is the first square, they might use multiple handkerchiefs, but the first one, they actually like end to end, they connect and make it into a triangle and then tie around. So you need a square for that. And I guess that 1 yard by 1 yard is sort of the ideal measurement for that particular kind of dyeing. And so you see that is almost always these handkerchiefs that are produced and exported to the Caribbean are that 90 centimeters by 90 centimeters.
And is that yard by yard, is the yard to do with production Or is it you're saying that it's already deemed by use,
Use. I think it's
but it's not to do with weaving at all?
Yeah, no, but like you can, so how they come usually is like it's a roll and then you
Right.
cut the yard. Yeah. So you cut the piece clothes into pieces. And that's the 90, but they weave it as a roll and they show where to cut because the design kind of starts over again.
But the yard is standard
Yeah.
size.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I look forward to seeing more, particularly in the budget cuts, but we will all move forward.
Thank you.
Javaria?
Thank you for your lovely presentation. My question was about differences in meaning with how handkerchiefs are used by different populations across time and space. So one thing I was cognizant of is that textiles, particularly like obviously headscarves and things, are used by many communities in South Asia, right? Sikh communities, Muslim communities, but they have very different meanings. And I was curious if you see something similar when you see the exporting of these handkerchiefs, for example, to Caribbean communities. Like, what does it mean for the same textile to be used across various religious ceremonies or cultural practices? Is there's a shift in meaning? Even now, it's like the lungi dance becoming something, but you saw this handkerchief dance in the painting of brunettes.
Yeah.
So that's what I was curious about.
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. And it's a little bit harder to answer that question, mainly because there's a lot of disparity in the way, as you said, like, they're used and also the meanings attached. The one thing that we have sort of seen happen is, or like we have some scholarship, is how in the Caribbean cultures, these are probably the way they're used is coming in from the West, actually from West Africa, where when the enslaved people were forcefully brought over, they brought in part of the use of these headscarves and neckcloths as part of their culture that they practice in West Africa to the Caribbean. And so I think there's like a tentative link there that needs to be explored more. There's not enough scholarship on it yet. And hopefully, like, if we can get more grants, we can figure out that complexity or like that one thread of connection. Pun unintended, but also intended based on the name of the project. But it's also the way it's developing in these different cultures are, as you said, it's not the same. Like, they are developing in one. There are some connections. So, for example, the grisettes, or the working women in France, Bordeaux, using these textiles, it's because the textiles are being made in France in that 90 centimeter by 90 centimeter, square pattern to be exported to the Caribbean. But they understand that that can be used as a headscarf because, of that, of the way it's being tied and the way it can be used. So sometimes, like, even without knowing the meaning of its use, they become used because of the qualities, the physical qualities of the textile itself. So there's a lot of complexities to their use, and it's very much localized and place-based. Some of it is very much cultural, and I can go into it at some depth, but it's going to take a while because there's so much to unpack there.
Thank you. So, Deepthi, this is a project international in scope, also an internationally collaborative project. What are some challenges towards running an international collaborative endeavor, especially these days?
Oi. We were just blessed that we've got a team that really works well together, and we have all become friends over the course of doing this project, which is really nice. And we all enjoy just doing this work collaboratively. So in actual sort of execution or the process of the project, it works great because we also have our own sort of expertise, if you will. Like, Meha is the lead PI, and she's also the global historian, material culture historian. So she kind of looks at the big picture of all this. Victoria Di Lorenzo, whom I didn't mention earlier, who's our core researcher, she is the archival person. So she does most of the archival work. We all contribute, but she does the bulk of the archival work. Jason Hepler here, my colleague at the center, he's the web developer / historian. And he helps, sort of with me as the digital history specialist, I guess, and art historian. We kind of work together on the digital aspects, and then others sort of give us feedback. So we all have like multiple expertise, and that really has worked well because we can bring all our sort of interdisciplinary skills together to the project. We've been exceptionally lucky in the past of getting grants, the grants that are large enough to do projects of this nature. We got an NEH and an AHRC grant to start us off with. Then we got a follow-on AHRC grant. Then we got another NEH grant, which got canceled by DOGE. So we have had a lot of grants that has helped us get here. But that's also the challenge. Like, if you're doing this sort of like interdisciplinary, cross-cultural, global projects, you need money. And that is difficult, getting even more difficult now to source with the NEH being where it is. And in the latest, they have reorganized the NEH, and in the current way in which it's set up, there's not much money for DH projects anywhere. They have expressly asked people not to use the collaborative grants, which prior to this, DH projects could apply. Now they said no DH projects in the collaborative section also. So there's maybe one available for a DH project when there used to be a whole Office of Digital Humanities at the NEH. So it's going to be a real issue going forward, I think, for all of us who are working in DH in the US.
I think you're right. It's going to be an absolute challenge, but it's good to have, you're already working with a community of folks that are fun to work with. And so I think that helps mitigate some of the challenges, but notwithstanding, if you've got money, you know where to send it. Kristen Jacobson asks, could you please describe the Digital Chintz project as well?
Hi, Kristen. Thank you for the question. So the Digital Chintz actually is a project that started before. It's not a project, really. It is, I would say, an activity that I do when I have time now. So when I first joined Mason as a postdoc, I wanted to kind of look at the cross-pollination between DH and art history, because there's not a lot of art historians in DH, if you haven't noticed. And so I was hoping to get a corpus of objects or data to work with. And my prior work was in ivory and wood objects from southwestern India, and nobody works on that. Like literally no one else works on it. It's just me. So I knew there was going to be a long time before I'd be able to develop a data set that I can work with for anything DH related. And so I said, okay, let me look at chintzes or kalamkaris. They were like these painted textiles, printed and painted textiles from India that was widely in use across the world, very, very popular in Europe and North America. And so that's where Digital Chintz started. I continue to work on it partly. My questions there is really looking at museums metadata most of the while, and thinking about how do you think of museum metadata as data set that you can use? How do you most often these museum metadata are created by humans for humans. They're human readable, even though if they're in spreadsheets, they're not machine readable. So there is a conversion, there's a translation that needs to happen to make that museum metadata available. And there is a vast amount of resources or information, knowledge that's collected within museum metadata, because curators for the last 100 years have been preparing them across many North American and European museum collections, except they are not accessible as a knowledge source to people outside of the museum. So we don't think about them as primary or secondary source that we can use outside of the museum. So my project is really looking at museum metadata and seeing, how do you create data sets from them, and what kind of visualizations can we produce by looking at the museum metadata. So that's sort of the experimental project that I do when I have time.
Dan Hallett.
Hi, Deepthi. You actually started touching on things I want to ask about, because I wanted to bring up the data stuff, since you and I have talked about data a number of times. I'm curious, can you talk about like the subjectivity of art history data and like the challenges, especially where with textiles, how it's going to be represented in art, there's going to be artistic license in some of this, and how you're dealing with those challenges?
Yeah, thanks, Dan, for the question. I know that we've had some conversations about it. This is something that I think anybody who works with computational history faces, where you want to figure out, like, we are trying to binarize data that is not made to be binarized. So we have to often sort of narrow down data, and there's some amount of knowledge erasure in that process. And I think it's made much more visible in art history because a lot of art historical data is subjective, arguably subjective. And so it's something that I have come to the conclusion that one thing that I will be okay with is taking away some parts of the data from any data set I'm working on if I cannot inculcate it within the data model. So I'm very I'm okay with some amount of knowledge erasure from data sets or the data models that I create from the data set. The second thing is being very, very transparent that that's happening. Like, that is something that I'm actively doing, that there is culling of information that's happening because computational analysis requires certain kinds of matrices to which art historical data just doesn't bend. So transparency, and then being erasing data or making data not part of data sets that doesn't quite fit in, and being transparent that I'm doing that. That's sort of where I have reached in terms of methodology.
Jeanette.
Hey, Deepthi. Kristen and I were chatting in the chat. Can you explain to us about deer washing? Is this a common practice? We're just very curious about that piece that you showed at the start.
I don't know. I don't know if they wash deer very often, but the idea of those Brunias' paintings, thank you for bringing it up, because I think I should always contextualize Brunias a little bit whenever that comes up. I think he's Brunius and not Brunias. Sorry if I'm pronouncing his last name wrong. But essentially, what they're doing, all these painters in the 18th century, they are painting these, not just him, but other painters, they're painting these luscious, exotic landscapes and people. And what they're doing is they're making these paintings for people in Britain who will then look at this and say, come here, you can invest in these plantations, you can have all this land and all these enslaved people. And that's what really these paintings are for. And so I think they want to add to the exoticism. They want to add to the colorful sort of milieu of the Caribbean world. And so I don't know if that's why the deer is there. Not sure about them being washed, but also you'll see that the women who are washing the deer, they have the cloth and the sponge or the suds in their hands, but they're dressed in their finery, right? Nobody's washing a deer wearing the clothes that they're wearing, especially if you're a domestic servant and you only have 2 nice pieces of clothes. So it's clearly staged. But to answer your original question, I don't know if that was a regular practice.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
Now, I'm just imagining going out in the evenings when there's a couple of deer that like to lounge in my yard, and whether or not they're expecting to be washed before they go to bed. Kirsten Sword asks, could you please share the back-end tools you are using for your databases, both for the project and individually?
Yes, that's a great question too. So all our website is built on a Django tech stack. So we have Django, and then we have a Wagtail CMS, a content management system in which our exhibitions exist. So those are two of the things that, and Django is sort of there's a PostgreSQL database attached to the Django. So that's sort of the things that we're using in the front end. On the back end, as we were working on this, don't tell anyone, we used Google spreadsheets. And the reason why we used them was because we are working across many different countries. Microsoft Outlook that Mason likes using, they don't allow you access, without asking for permission 100 times. And it was just not conducive to doing collaborative work. So we did use Google Sheets. And we will I am in the process of developing a method to use Airtable instead of Google Sheets, because it really did get very confusing towards the end the way we were trying to use Google Sheet to do some of this work. So the next stage of the project, I think I'm going to move us into an Airtable and then figure out how to do our data collection and data processing a little bit better.
It would be nice if all of these technologies just talked to each other and played nice with each other, but alas. John Balls, last question, and it's a great one.
Hi, thanks for a wonderful presentation. Can you just share more about the classroom experience with this? From you, from others, things you've heard, just what students say, and any tips on using the materials?
Yes, thank you. So I did show briefly the lesson plans. The lesson plans are purposely elaborate, and that's because we wanted to provide everything and then for instructors kind of to choose what they want. And I think that's what's been happening from what we have learned. Like, the lesson plans are not being used in whole, but parts of the lesson plan is used as an inspiration for what they want to do in class. We've heard back from people saying they're using the database as in DH classes as a way to kind of take a controlled database to do class experiments or class projects. We've heard from some global trade or business history classrooms who have used the project to do like a week on textiles or global trade or things like that. That's sort of how it's being used. One of the things that we are hoping to do is to create some sort of like smaller or like easily plug and play lesson plans for like K through 12. That hasn't happened yet. Like our lesson plans are clearly geared towards undergrad audience. And that's partly because we don't have K through 12 experience. So we don't have K through 12 teaching experience, and it didn't feel right to kind of make lesson plans for something that we don't have experience in. But we are hoping that in the future we can kind of bring that down further to be used in classrooms other than like an undergrad classroom.
I think that's a great place to end it. Deepthi, thank you very much for showing off connecting threads. And folks, thank you very much for coming to see us.
Thank you so much, Martha and Jim, for organizing this. This was fun. Thanks.
Thank you. We will see you back here in a couple of weeks.